I was still half asleep when a knock on my front door jolted me awake. It wasn't the usual knock from a neighbor borrowing sugar or a package delivery. This one had a sharpness to it, like someone was announcing a war rather than just asking if I had any milk. I rubbed my eyes, peered through the blinds, and froze. Standing there were three people, clipboards in hand, faces set in that unnervingly serious expression that screams, "I mean business." It took me a full minute to realize why my stomach had suddenly dropped to my knees. These were from the HOA, and they didn't just come for a chat. Before I could even process it, one of them stepped forward, chest puffed up like a drill sergeant. "You have 3 hours to join the homeowners association or you will be evicted," she announced. Evicted, in 3 hours, as if someone could just pick up and throw me off my own property before my coffee had even finished brewing. I blinked at them. "Excuse me?" I asked, still half expecting one of them to say, "Just kidding." The tallest one, a man with a clipboard practically choking him from being too heavy with authority, glared down at me. "You received notice. It's final. Either you comply or we take legal action immediately." I stared back. The absurdity of it hit me, and for a moment I actually laughed, half in disbelief, half because the idea of 3 self-important people trying to evict me from land I literally owned seemed almost comical. "Okay," I said slowly, careful to keep my voice calm. "Before we continue, could one of you tell me who owns this land again?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that makes you realize you're standing on the thin edge between comedy and chaos. The woman's eyes widened, and the other two exchanged nervous glances. Suddenly, the aura of authority that had draped over them like an ill-fitting suit seemed to evaporate. I could see the gears turning in their heads as they tried to remember exactly whose backyard this was. Spoiler alert, it was mine. I stepped aside to open the door fully, letting them in. Not that they had any legal claim to do so, but letting them in seemed like the polite thing to do while savoring the rising tension. As they shuffled awkwardly into the entryway, I noticed every little detail. The one with the clipboard nervously tapping a pen, the woman trying to suppress a cough that sounded suspiciously like panic, and the third guy who looked like he wanted to disappear through the nearest wall. "You see," I continued, pointing vaguely to the house and the surrounding property, "I checked the records. My name is right here. It even says property owner in bold letters. I think there might be some confusion." Their leader cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "Well, we still recommend." "Recommend what?" I interrupted, keeping my tone light but my eyes sharp. "That I let 3 people with clipboards dictate the rules of my own land. Is that it?" They exchanged panicked glances again, whispering in hushed tones as if I couldn't hear them. The suspense was almost delicious. It was like watching a slow-motion comedy unfold, except the stakes were technically very real. I could almost hear my neighbors in their houses, probably peeking through blinds, wondering why 3 adults were standing awkwardly on my lawn like kids caught in a prank. One of them finally spoke up. "We have the right to enforce the HOA rules." "Enforce?" I echoed, my eyebrows rising. "Right, and that includes evicting someone from land they own in less than 3 hours. The absurdity of the situation was so rich I could taste it. I leaned casually against the doorframe, trying not to grin too much while they fumbled for words. They didn't have any. "We can call the sheriff," the tallest one muttered, almost as if saying it louder would make it true. I laughed quietly to myself. "Sure, call the sheriff. I'll make them a cup of coffee while they're here, maybe explain who actually owns the property while we wait." They went pale. I could see the exact moment panic replaced confidence. Their authoritative stance crumpled as they realized that the looming threat of eviction had suddenly evaporated into thin air. They had come thinking this was going to be their victory, and instead, they were standing on land that didn't legally belong to them at all. The tension in the air was electric, almost cinematic. I could see the start of an internal debate in their eyes. Do we admit defeat now, or do we push and make fools of ourselves even more? Little did they know this was just the opening act. I had 3 hours to play with, and the game was about to get very interesting. As they muttered among themselves, trying to salvage what little dignity they had left, I smiled politely. Well, I said, shall we discuss this over coffee, or are we planning to storm my property with clipboards and threats? They didn't answer. They just looked at each other like deer caught in headlights. And in that moment, I knew the morning was going to be one for the record books. I watched them huddle on my porch, whispering frantically, and couldn't help but feel a mix of amusement and disbelief. They were treating my property like some enchanted land where rules were made up as you went, and somehow I was the intruder. It was almost impressive, almost. The tallest one finally turned to me, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "We have the right to enforce fines for non-compliance," he said, his voice a little shaky. "You could be financially responsible for violating HOA rules." I raised an eyebrow, hiding a smirk. "Oh, really?" I asked, leaning against the door frame, casual but alert. "And where exactly do your rules apply? Because last I checked, I own every inch of this property. That includes the lawn you're standing on." The pause this time was even longer than before. You could almost see the mental gears grinding, desperately trying to reconcile the fact that they were demanding obedience from someone who literally held the deed. One of them muttered something about legal counsel. I had to stifle a laugh. Legal counsel? In 3 hours. I'd be surprised if they could even Google the right law before they tripped over my driveway. They tried another tactic. The woman in the middle, whose cheeks had gone pale enough to match her blouse, cleared her throat and said, "Well, even if, you own the land, we could still report you to the sheriff for non-compliance. They enforce HOA rules." I tilted my head and smiled innocently. "Oh, that's cute. Really cute. You mean the sheriff might come here and ask me politely to join your association? Because I'm sure they have nothing better to do than stand on my porch and tell me to pay dues I didn't agree to." They didn't laugh. In fact, I think they were starting to realize that sarcasm was going to be my weapon of choice this morning. They whispered again among themselves, and I couldn't resist taking a slow, deliberate walk around the edge of the property. I pointed out survey stakes, tree lines, and fences, narrating for my imaginary audience in my head. "Look at these beautiful boundaries. Isn't it fascinating how clearly property lines can be drawn when you actually own the land?" The tallest one shifted uncomfortably. I could see him calculating the odds, probably thinking about the sheriff, the neighbors, and the internet lawyers who might be called if things escalated. My coffee had gone cold, but the thrill of watching 3 people in panic mode made it worth it. I decided to push the tension a little further. "You know," I said, slowing my steps, "I was actually wondering, how far are you willing to go to enforce rules on someone who owns the property? Are we talking eviction notices in the driveway, perhaps a formal citation taped to my mailbox, or maybe just standing here awkwardly while I enjoy my morning?" The woman's hands tightened around her clipboard. The third board member, a younger guy who hadn't spoken yet, muttered something about precedent and looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. It was almost cinematic, the classic suburban showdown, but with clipboards instead of guns. I half expected dramatic music to swell from somewhere in the background. And then the inevitable happened, the sheriff. One of them finally blurted out, "We've called the sheriff. They're on the way." I smiled, resisting the urge to laugh out loud. Oh, good. I was hoping for a little audience to witness this little morning drama. They went pale again. I could see the internal panic building. Not only did they have to face me, the homeowner, who apparently knew the law, but now there was the looming presence of an authority figure who, as it turns out, doesn't take kindly to people demanding eviction on land they don't own. As we waited, the tension was palpable. I walked slowly through my yard, letting them stew in uncertainty. Every glance they exchanged screamed fear, confusion, and I suspect a growing realization that their perfect plan was collapsing fast. I kept my voice light but firm, pointing out minor things in my yard. "Oh, and these stakes here, surveyor confirmed. This fence, mine. Oh, and yes, the trees, also mine." I could practically hear the mental countdown in their heads. 3 hours to comply, and they were still standing on my land, unsure whether to retreat, call the sheriff, or just quietly disappear. The suspense was delicious. I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let it go. And then one of them, finally breaking the silence, said almost as an afterthought, "Maybe we should reconsider how we approach this." I raised an eyebrow and smiled politely. It was just the beginning, and I knew the rest of the morning was going to be even more interesting. The clock was ticking, and the real fun was about to start. The clock was ticking, and the 3 HOA board members were still standing on my property, looking like deer caught in headlights. Their initial confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a mixture of fear and confusion. I could see it in the way they fidgeted with clipboards, shuffled papers, and whispered under their breath. The 3-hour deadline they had set suddenly seemed meaningless, at least to me. I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let them forget it. I decided it was time to escalate subtly, the kind of escalation that doesn't involve yelling or threats, just quiet, confident authority. I walked slowly around the edge of my property, gesturing casually to the survey stakes, fences, and clearly marked boundaries. "See these?" I asked, pointing to the stakes. "This is the edge of my land. Everything beyond this line is, well, yours to walk on if you want, but it's not really yours to boss me around." One of them, the tallest guy, tried to interrupt with a half-hearted explanation about HOA jurisdiction. I raised a hand. "Oh, don't get me wrong. I love a good argument about rules and regulations, but you're standing on land that literally has my name on it. Legally, morally, and practically, this is my backyard. So yes, I'm afraid your argument has, let's say, limited application." Their faces were priceless. I could see panic creeping into their eyes as they realized the absurdity of the morning. They had come in thinking this would be a simple intimidation tactic, and now they were on the front lines of a battle they had no idea how to fight. The woman in the middle kept glancing nervously at the others, probably silently pleading for someone to save her from this nightmare. And then came the fines. Yes, the fines. Apparently, according to them, I was supposed to be financially punished for refusing to join their little club. I almost laughed out loud. "Fines, huh?" I said. "For living on land I own? How imaginative." I kept my voice calm, but let a hint of sarcasm seep through. "I suppose next you'll be issuing tickets for walking on my driveway without a permit." They whispered again, clearly struggling to figure out how to enforce anything when the law was clearly on my side. I walked closer, slowing my pace, and added, "You know, I could help you. I could even print out a map and highlight my property lines in bright neon colors. Maybe then it'll sink in that trespassing fines probably don't apply when the trespasser is the one holding the deed." The tallest one took a deep breath and muttered something about legal precedent. I smiled inwardly. Yes, legal precedent, a concept they clearly had never encountered in practice. I could almost see their brains overheating as they tried to compute the possibility that their perfect little morning plan had crashed and burned before it even started. I glanced at my watch. 1 hour down to go, and they were still standing there, paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the irony. Here I was, enjoying my morning, while 3 supposed authority figures were losing their composure faster than I could count. The woman finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "We could involve the sheriff." "Perfect," I said brightly. "I was hoping for a little audience. Maybe they can explain to you the difference between ownership and authority. I've always wanted someone else to validate how clearly my property lines are marked." Their whispers turned frantic. I could almost hear the internal panic. What if the sheriff sides with the homeowner? What if the neighbors start watching? What if the internet finds out about this debacle? The suspense was electric, hanging in the air like thick fog. I decided to push the tension just a little further. "You know," I said casually, "I could even make it interesting. Let's set some ground rules for today. You stay on the porch, I stay in my house, and we see who cracks first. Spoiler alert, it's probably going to be you." The board members froze. Their mouths opened and closed, searching for words that didn't exist. They muttered among themselves again, clearly considering retreating, but pride, or maybe stubbornness, kept them rooted in place. I could feel the momentum shifting entirely in my favor. The suspense was building, and I knew the real test was about to begin. How far would they go before realizing that my calm, sarcastic confidence was an unbeatable weapon? As the minutes passed, their nervous energy grew more pronounced. I could see them glancing at each other, at the driveway, even at my windows, as if hoping to divine some secret strategy. Meanwhile, I kept my movements slow, deliberate, and completely unhurried, letting every second of their hesitation stretch the suspense further. This was the moment where things could spiral, where the next move would define the morning, and I was ready. The 3-hour countdown was halfway over, and the 3 HOA board members were still lingering on my property, looking more disoriented by the minute. Their clipboards had become shields for their pride, and their whispers more frantic as they tried to figure out how to make their threats stick. I could see it clearly. Their confidence had crumbled, replaced by a quiet panic that made me almost feel sorry for them. Almost. I decided to take a slow stroll around the yard, sipping my now lukewarm coffee, narrating in my head as if I had a private audience. Here we have the HOA, valiantly attempting to enforce rules on land they do not own. Notice the subtle fear in their eyes and the nervous tapping of clipboards against thighs. Truly a masterpiece of suburban drama. The tallest one straightened and tried to reassert control. "We can still issue fines," he said, in a voice that lacked its earlier conviction. I tilted my head, letting a small, amused smile creep onto my face. "Fines? Really? And how do you intend to collect them? Shall I write a check out to HOA Authority Fantasy League?" I could see the flicker of doubt pass over their faces. They were grasping for leverage, but the whole setup had already slipped through their fingers. One of them tried to be clever, pointing at the tiny HOA compliance signs I had ignored for months. "These signs indicate mandatory membership." I raised a hand and waved toward the yard. "Signs are decorative. You've done a wonderful job placing them, really, but this is still my land. I own the grass under your feet, the trees above your heads, and last I checked, the driveway you've been packing nervously." The woman's hands clenched around her clipboard. She muttered something about consulting a lawyer, but her voice wobbled. The youngest board member whispered something about neighbors and community expectations, as if I hadn't been watching the neighborhood gossip peeking through blinds for the past half hour. I had an audience now, and the suspense wasn't just between me and the HOA. It was tangible across the block. I decided to turn the heat up, but subtly, letting their imagination do half the work. "You know, it's fascinating," I said, moving slowly toward the porch. "How authority can be so fragile when confronted with facts. It's almost poetic. I could watch this all day." Their eyes widened. They glanced at each other, clearly unsure if retreat was honorable or admitting defeat, but I let them stew. I could see the internal debate raging. Call the sheriff, escalate fines, or just run away before more humiliation. And then came the absurdity of their last attempt. The tallest one stepped forward and said, "We could file an injunction." I raised both eyebrows and leaned casually against the railing. "An injunction, right, to stop me from owning my own land. Brilliant strategy. Let me guess, you found that in a movie somewhere." The tension in the air was nearly tangible. My heart was racing a little, not from fear, but from the thrill of seeing them unravel. The suspense wasn't just about whether they could legally evict me. It was about how far they would go in their own embarrassment before backing down. I glanced at my watch again. 1 hour, 45 minutes left. They were still here, trapped in indecision, unsure how to proceed. I decided to give them a little visual reminder of who was in charge. Slowly, deliberately, I walked past the fence, pointing out survey markers, the clear property line, even the mailbox they had been fixating on. "See this? Mine. See that? Also mine. Every inch is mine, but don't worry, I'm being very patient." They muttered among themselves again, and I caught the youngest glancing nervously at the street, probably hoping a neighbor would intervene and end the tension. But this was my moment, and I wasn't ready to give up the stage. As the suspense built, I could see cracks forming. One of them, frustrated, muttered something about public perception, and what if the neighborhood sees us? I suppressed a grin. Yes, public perception. Exactly what I had been counting on. The suspense wasn't just for me. It was a slow, agonizing reveal for them, a lesson in underestimating a homeowner who knew their rights. The minutes ticked by. The 3-hour deadline felt simultaneously urgent and irrelevant. They were floundering, and I was calm, deliberate, enjoying the slow unraveling of their authority. Every whisper, every nervous glance added to the tension. The suspense was almost cinematic, like the pause before the climactic showdown, and I knew the turning point was approaching. And then, almost in unison, one of them finally said the words I had been waiting for. "Maybe we should rethink this." I smiled politely, but inside I was savoring the victory. The countdown continued, but the momentum had shifted. The HOA had lost control, and the suspense was now theirs to bear. The rest of the morning promised even more tension, and I was ready to enjoy every second. As the countdown ticked closer to the halfway point of their 3-hour ultimatum, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began to peek out of their windows. First, a few cautious glances, then a brave soul stepped onto their porch to get a better view. I noticed them trying not to be seen, holding coffee mugs and newspapers like shields. It was as if my little suburban standoff had become the season finale of everyone's mourning. I couldn't help but grin. The suspense was multiplying. The HOA, oblivious to their growing audience, continued to fumble with clipboards and papers, whispering frantic strategies that made no sense. The woman in the middle had started tapping her pen in what could only be described as a nervous rhythm, while the tallest one kept packing, muttering under his breath. The youngest, still hopping to disappear into the grass, peeked over his clipboard to see if anyone else had noticed the absurdity of the situation. I decided to subtly play to the crowd. Walking past the line of survey stakes, I waved casually at the neighbors. "Good morning," I said, as if nothing unusual was happening. "Don't mind them, they just like to hang around on other people's property." The neighbors stifled laughter, and I could see the tension in the HOA's shoulders tight. They clearly hadn't accounted for public scrutiny. One of them tried to regain authority. "We can still impose fines, you know," the tallest one said, his voice wavering. "Failure to comply is punishable under HOA rules." I raised an eyebrow. "Fines? On my property? Fantastic. I'm thrilled you brought this up. Tell me, do these fines come with complimentary coffee while you explain why I need to pay for the right to exist here?" They whispered furiously to each other, their panic now mingled with embarrassment. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse of confidence, and I was front row center. The suspense was almost tangible. Would they push forward, or would they crumble under the combined weight of the law, public scrutiny, and their own absurdity? Deciding to press my advantage, I took another casual stroll, gesturing at the clearly marked boundaries. "These stakes here. Surveyor confirmed. Fences, mine. Mailbox, also mine. The tiny sign that says HOA property, purely decorative. I like the color, though." The woman muttered something about consulting lawyers, but even she sounded doubtful. I let a beat pass, savoring the pause before adding, "You know, it's fascinating. You came here thinking you had power, and now, well, I think it's clear who actually owns the authority in this situation." The youngest board member's face had turned an interesting shade of pale. He whispered something like, "We might need backup," and I smiled inwardly. Yes, backup, as if someone else could magically make the property mine. The suspense was building like a slow crescendo, the kind that keeps you on the edge of your seat. At this point, the neighbors started inching closer, some even stepping onto the edge of their lawns to watch. One brave woman from 2 doors down waved at me and mouthed, "You got this." The tension on the HOA's faces was priceless. They were caught in a trap of their own making, unsure how far to push without public embarrassment. I decided to add a little humor to remind them who was really in control. "You know," I said, packing slowly and pointing at the sidewalk, "this is a beautiful neighborhood, lots of lovely homes, but here's a fun fact: this particular plot, including all the grass and trees, belongs entirely to me. I even have documentation. If you'd like, I can make a presentation with charts and graphs, maybe even a slideshow." The tallest one's pen fell from his hand. The woman's jaw dropped slightly, and the youngest glanced nervously at the neighbors, as if realizing the stakes were much higher than they had imagined. The suspense was now layered, legal, social, and psychological. Every passing second made it clearer that this morning was far from normal. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The woman, clearly at her wit's end, took a step back and muttered, "Maybe we should just leave." The suspense hit its peak. Would they retreat, or would pride keep them rooted to the spot? I stayed calm, smiling politely, enjoying every second of the hesitation. The neighbors leaned in, sensing the climax of this suburban showdown. I knew the real showdown was approaching, the moment when the HOA would realize that all their threats, all their ultimatums, and all their paperwork were powerless against someone who knew the law and knew their property. As the clock ticked down, I felt a thrill of anticipation. The tension, the panic, the humor, it was all building to a moment that none of us would forget, and I couldn't wait to see exactly how this standoff would end. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The HOA board members were still hovering on my property, clearly unsure if they should retreat, escalate, or pretend the morning never happened. The neighbors had now fully emerged, some leaning over fences, some standing at the edge of their driveways, all watching with barely contained amusement. The suspense was palpable, like the calm before a suburban storm. I decided it was time to up the ante. I walked slowly across my yard, gesturing casually at every corner of my property. "See these trees?" I asked, pointing at the largest oaks lining my yard. "Mine, surveyor approved, and yes, the fence along the side, also mine. Oh, and this lovely flower bed, you guessed it, mine as well. Is ownership a wonderful thing?" Their faces twisted in panic. The woman's grip on her clipboard had become almost painful, her knuckles white, while the tallest board member muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "This can't be legal." The youngest, poor guy, looked like he wanted to teleport to a different dimension entirely. They whispered frantically among themselves, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. I let them stew for a few moments, savoring the tension. It was like watching a slow-motion unraveling, and I was front and center with popcorn in my head. And then came the next move, their final attempt to assert authority. The tallest one straightened, cleared his throat, and said, "We could file for a temporary injunction." I blinked, pretending to be impressed. "An injunction?" I said slowly. "On land I own, brilliant, really creative thinking. Let me know how that works out for you. Maybe I can bring popcorn for the court proceedings too." The woman's jaw dropped, and the youngest leaned on the railing, clearly hoping the ground would swallow him whole. Their confidence had crumbled completely, replaced by sheer panic and disbelief. I could see them calculating, recalculating, and then recalculating again. The suspense was like a drumbeat, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. I decided to add a little humor to the mix because why not? "You know," I said, packing slowly, "I've always wondered how far people will go when they think they have power. This is fascinating. I mean, look at you all, standing on someone else's property, trying to enforce rules that don't apply. It's poetic, really." One of them whispered something about lawyers. I chuckled inwardly. Lawyers, yes. They had 3 hours to somehow summon legal authority, and I had a front row seat to their floundering. I knew it would be impossible for them to escalate effectively, and I intended to savor every moment. The neighbors were now leaning over fences, whispering to each other, and a few were even nodding subtly in my direction. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. Public scrutiny was my ally. The tension was no longer just between me and the HOA, it had become a shared suspense, a slow-burning drama that everyone on the street was now invested in. I walked closer to the group, speaking in a calm, deliberate voice. "You see, this is a beautiful neighborhood full of lovely homes, but this particular parcel, including the grass, trees, and even the driveway, is entirely mine. I know, it's shocking. I thought you might like to take notes. Maybe next time double-check property records before issuing ultimatums." They froze. The tallest one's pen had fallen to the ground again, the woman looked ready to faint, and the youngest glanced nervously at the spectators, realizing they were witnessing the complete collapse of authority. The suspense was at its peak, the moment before the showdown, the tension crackling in the air. And then came the realization, the slow dawning of defeat in their eyes. They whispered, they shuffled, they muttered, but the truth was unavoidable. They were completely outmatched, and the climax was approaching. The sheriff had been called, the neighbors were watching, and their bluff had been fully exposed. I smiled politely, letting the suspense linger. This was the moment when the HOA finally understood that all their threats, all their ultimatums, and all their paperwork were meaningless against someone who knew their rights and owned the land. And I, calmly sipping my coffee, was ready to enjoy every second of the final act. The countdown continued, the tension grew, and the stage was set. Soon, the morning would end with a lesson in humility, authority, and just how powerless someone can be when they forget whose backyard they're standing in. By now, the tension had reached a fever pitch. The neighbors had fully emerged, leaning over fences, peeking from windows, and even stepping onto driveways just to watch the drama unfold. The HOA board members were trembling ever so slightly, clutching clipboards as if they could use them as armor against the reality of their situation. The 3-hour deadline was approaching, but for once, I was calm. I knew the morning was about to reach its peak, and I intended to savor every second. And then the sheriff arrived. A black and white cruiser rolled slowly down the street, tires crunching on the gravel. My heart did a little flip, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. This was the final piece of the puzzle. As the officer stepped out and approached, I could see the relief mixed with residual panic on the faces of the HOA members. Suddenly, authority had arrived, and it was about to validate exactly whose side it should be on. The tallest board member cleared his throat nervously and tried to explain the situation. We were enforcing HOA rules. The sheriff gave him a long, assessing look, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. So you're saying you're trying to evict someone from land they own? He asked. Simple words, but heavy with judgment. The woman in the middle opened her mouth, then closed it again. The youngest board member looked like he had swallowed a golf ball. The suspense was electric. The neighbors leaned in even closer, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived. I stepped forward, keeping my tone calm but deliberate. Yes, officer. They came here claiming I had 3 hours to join an association or be evicted. I tried to explain that I own the property and that fines or ultimatums don't apply in this situation. I gestured around at the clearly marked boundaries, the stakes, the fences. I have all documentation, surveyor reports, deeds, the works. It's all very straightforward. The sheriff nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I could see the shift in the HOA member's demeanor as he continued to examine the property lines. Suddenly, the stakes of the morning were crystal clear to them. This was no longer about fines or intimidation. It was about reality, and reality had firmly sided with me. The tallest one tried again in a weak attempt to assert control. But we have rules. Rules? I interrupted, smiling politely. Yes, I've seen the rules, wonderful rules, but rules don't override property ownership. I'm happy to provide the deeds if there's any confusion. The sheriff raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the neighbors, many of whom were nodding subtly or whispering comments like, "Finally," and about time someone stood up to them. The public scrutiny had reached its peak, adding an invisible weight to every word, glance, and movement. The suspense was almost unbearable for the HOA members. They had reached the point where every second felt like a trap. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The sheriff, quietly but firmly, addressed the HOA. You're standing on property owned by the person you're trying to evict. You have no legal authority to enforce your rules here. I suggest you leave before things get more complicated. The tallest board member's face went pale. The woman muttered something incoherent, and the youngest simply sagged, as if gravity had suddenly doubled. They glanced at each other, realizing that every threat, every ultimatum, every clipboard-swinging attempt at intimidation had failed spectacularly. The suspense had now completely shifted. They were the ones waiting for an outcome beyond their control. I stepped back, letting the silence hang for a moment. "Thank you, officer," I said, my tone calm, almost conversational, while inside I felt a surge of triumph. This was the peak of the morning's drama. The sheriff's presence validated everything I had calmly explained over the past few hours. My calm, sarcastic confidence had won the day. The board members shuffled awkwardly, muttering among themselves, and finally began retreating. Clipboards dragging on the ground, faces red with embarrassment, they slowly left the property. The neighbors exhaled collectively, some quietly cheering, others laughing softly at the spectacle. The suspense, the panic, the drama, it had reached its natural conclusion. I watched them go, shaking my head slightly in amusement. The climax had passed, but the memory of this morning, the suspense, the humor, the absurdity would linger for a long time. I took a deep breath, feeling victorious, and made a mental note to double-check that the property lines were still intact. They were, of course. After all, owning the land has its privileges. As the sheriff left, nodding politely in my direction, I couldn't help but smile. The morning had been surreal, hilarious, and tense all at once. The lesson was clear. Confidence, knowledge of your rights, and a little humor can turn even the most absurd threats into a story worth telling. And somewhere in the neighborhood, I knew, someone was already telling this story to their morning coffee crowd, because mornings like this are impossible to forget. The morning had finally settled into an almost surreal quiet. The HOA board members had retreated, dragging clipboards and bruised egos behind them, leaving me standing on my property like the triumphant protagonist of a suburban epic. The neighbors were slowly dispersing, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others chuckling quietly, and a few giving me subtle thumbs-up gestures from across the street. The suspense that had dominated the past few hours had evaporated, replaced by a strange mix of relief, triumph, and lingering amusement. I walked across my yard, taking in the boundaries, the survey stakes, and the fences that had made my victory so clear. Every inch of this land belonged to me, and for the first time that morning, I could really appreciate the absurdity of the ordeal. I could almost hear a narrator in my head saying, "This is what happens when three people mistake authority for ownership." I smiled, sipping my now-cold coffee, thinking about the absurdity of it all. 3 adults had stormed my property, armed with clipboards and a misplaced sense of power, only to discover that they had zero leverage. The suspense, the drama, the rising panic, it had all been completely unnecessary, yet spectacular to witness. The neighbors trickled back inside their homes, some still peeking from curtains, probably retelling the morning's events to anyone who would listen. I could imagine their versions now. The brave homeowner standing firm, the bewildered HOA trembling under the weight of their own mistakes, and the suspense stretching to an almost cinematic peak before finally snapping in favor of justice. I decided to take a little stroll around the property, letting the adrenaline subside, and noticed small signs of the chaos they had caused. A knocked-over garden gnome, a few trampled flowers, and one particularly sad-looking hose that had been stepped on in the panic. I sighed, half in amusement, half in mock indignation. "You'd think they were storming a castle," I muttered to myself. But the humor of the situation didn't diminish the lesson. I had proven that calm confidence, knowledge of one's rights, and a touch of wit could neutralize even the most aggressive threats. The HOA had learned the hard way that rules mean little when they clash with actual property ownership, and I had the satisfaction of witnessing it firsthand. I walked back to my porch, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, the morning light bathing my yard in a victorious glow. It was peaceful now, the tension replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. The neighbors, I was certain, would carry this story around the neighborhood for weeks, maybe months, as a cautionary tale about overstepping boundaries, literally and figuratively. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, taking a seat on the porch, and let myself savor the moment. The suspense of the morning had been intense, but the payoff was even sweeter. My property was intact, my rights had been upheld, and the HOA had been humbled in the most public, dramatic, and slightly comical way imaginable. As I sipped my coffee, I reflected on the absurdity and beauty of the situation. The drama, the panic, the stakes, it had all been part of a suburban theater that I hadn't even auditioned for, yet somehow ended up starring in. The lesson was clear. Know your rights, stay calm under pressure, and never underestimate a homeowner who actually owns the land they're standing on. And as the neighborhood slowly returned to its regular rhythm, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The morning had been a battle of wills, authority, and absurdity, and the outcome was undeniable. The HOA had left with their pride bruised, the neighbors entertained, and me, standing firmly on my land, completely vindicated. I leaned back, smiling to myself. The ordeal was over, but the story, the suspense, the humor, the drama would linger far longer. It was a morning I would never forget, a lesson in standing your ground, and a reminder that sometimes the best way to win is simply to know your rights, remain calm, and let reality speak for itself. As I sipped the last of my coffee, I thought maybe next time, they'll think twice before trying to enforce rules on someone who owns every inch of the land they're standing on. And with that, I finally let myself relax, the morning's chaos giving way to a well-earned sense of victory, humor, and peace.